Children's literature is a relatively modern, historically engineered invention. For the vast majority of our history, it simply didn't exist as a constant fixture of human culture. Before the 1700s, any text specifically intended for children served a narrow purpose: reading instruction or strict puritanical moral conditioning. Without stories designed for their own entertainment, eager young readers were forced to appropriate literature written for adults. They seized upon whatever was available, turning to translations of Aesop's fables, popular ballads, and romances to satisfy their need for narrative. In this era, the child reader existed as a demographic, but the market didn't yet view them as a distinct group that required its own psychological escapism. This dynamic of children appropriating adult texts is not a relic of the past. It remains a common practice today. Modern youth readers frequently transition into adult thrillers and romances long before they reach maturity. They are often motivated by a search for more exciting, graphic details that are deliberately excluded from literature tailored to their own age group. This raises a central question: how did literature evolve from that adult-centered baseline into the highly protected, child-focused ecosystems we see now? The modern children's book only emerged after a series of significant shifts in demographics, education, and social philosophy. The first major shift arrived in the mid-18th century, critical mass of child readers who were eager for something new. They were supported by a new generation of parents who were finally willing to spend money on their children's solely on their education. In 1742, London merchant Thomas Boehme made an initial breakthrough with Janus, the Swedish giant. However, the industry reached a true turning point in 1744 with John Newbery's publication of A Little Pretty Pocketbook. Newbery hit upon a winning formula by combining rhymes, stories, and children's games into a single package. He even included physical gifts, a ball and a pincushion, which anticipated modern multimedia marketing. The book was so successful that it was almost immediately pirated in America. This focus on pleasure proved that the child as consumer was a lucrative demographic, and it changed the publishing landscape. This era of levity was brief. It was soon interrupted by a harsh pedagogical backlash. In 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile provided the intellectual spark, decreeing that all children's books except Robinson Crusoe were a dangerous diversion. Critics of the time followed suit, insisting that youth literature must return to being instructive and uplifting. Mrs. Sarah Trimmer became the leading voice of this movement. In her 1802 magazine, The Guardian of Education, she published the first regular reviews of children's books, famously condemning fairy tales for their violence and absurdity. Trimmer promoted her own alternative in 1786, Fabulous Histories, a series of stories featuring talking animals who served as models of sense and decorum. The moralist backlash was an attempt to re-engineer the children's book into a tool for social compliance, directly opposing the child's natural search for entertainment. These rigid moral stories were always unstable, largely because young readers had a way of drawing entertainment from even the sternest author. The decisive blow to this instructive literature came from an unexpected source, an academic interest in folklore. In 1842, James Orchard Halliwell selected a collection of nursery rhymes for a folklore society. This followed the 1823 English translation of the Grimm brothers' scholarly fairy stories, which became a massive hit with young readers. This revival forced subsequent editions to become increasingly child-centered, catering more directly to their limited experience of life. For older children, reading habits were shaped less by dedicated children's literature and more by access to specific types of characters. They looked for books featuring animals or young people they could empathize with, and plots involving exploring or fighting that made few demands on adult maturity. By the end of the 19th century, this combination of folklore-driven imagination and psychological empathy had displaced strict moral instruction as the market's primary driver. In the late 1930s, this evolution reached a peak where the primary objective was to protect the literary childhood from any unpleasant reality. This era was defined by bestsellers focused on pure, unapologetic escapism. British novelists Enid Blyton and Richmal Crompton were the primary architects of this escapist model. In Blyton's universe, children were free to engage in the most unlikely adventures, with the absolute guarantee that nothing bad could ever happen to them. This manufactured safety stood in stark contrast to history. World War II broke out just as Blyton's books reached their peak popularity. The global devastation of the war failed to register at all within the self-enclosed world of Blyton's characters. Children's literature had moved from the harsh morality of the Puritans to its exact opposite, an artificial, impenetrable bubble of childhood innocence. After the trauma of World War II, a reaction against these dream worlds was inevitable. The shift was fueled by the rapid growth of paperback sales, which made books more accessible to the general public. At the same time, the massive expansion of children's libraries provided a new institutional foundation for the medium. Progressive librarians and committed publishers began urging writers to embrace a new spirit of moral and social concern. Narratives began to shift, moving away from exclusive middle-class settings to reflect a more diverse real-world society. The post-war era matured children's literature, forcing it to engage with societal conditions rather than hiding from them. Today, modern critical analysis of children's literature focuses on two main tasks. The first is to rid these books of outdated social prejudice and exclusiveness. The second is to recognize the sophisticated achievements of contemporary youth authors. We've reached a point where high-quality children's works are now frequently recommended to adult readers. This trend reflects a 19th century belief that children's literature shouldn't be a defensive wall between childhood and maturity. Instead, it serves as a shared generational resource, essential for the necessary growth toward understanding the adult world. This video is brought to you by the IELTS FOCUS 084-770-5973, an English center specializing in IELTS preparation.